And we are back for the Thousand Worlds Book Club, and we're talking about Second Helpings. I am joined by Anguy. Hello, everybody. Second Helpings is our fourth Tuf story, and it continues the Sulum Tali Moon storyline. The link for the story is below. It's not a very long story, only about 25 pages, and it's a quick read in that it's mostly comedy. Sorry, but there's no audio out there for Second Helpings. So our story begins with us hearing about Tuf's interest in collecting ships, and there's a few interesting references here. We hear that Tuf had visited a planet of the Knights of St. Christopher, who are annoyed by raiding dragons. This is in reference to another story called The Way of Cross and Dragon, where the Knights of St. Christopher are inquisitors, dealing with the growth of a cult that believes Jesus was a dragon rider. And we hear about some of Tuf's shuttles. Two are named Manticore and Basilisk, which are a couple island chains over in Essos. So it's been 5 years since Loaves and Fishes, and Tuf has decided to return to Sulum. He doesn't trust the Sulumese near his ark, so he gets into a smaller ship and puts on a disguise. Now this is the second time that Tuf has put on a disguise, and it naturally makes me think of Varys, since the two are physically similar, and Varys also likes putting on disguises. Tuf, though, is certainly not as talented as Varys, and his disguises are played for comic effect. Now while being inspected on entry, Tuf hears about a Sulumese romantic adventure movie called Tuf and Moon, or The Pirate and the Portmaster. Tuf watches the film and then tries to get in contact with Tali Moon, but her secretary doesn't believe that it's him. He does eventually get to talk to Tali, and they discuss the movie a bit. Apparently Tuf was played by a mustached man, and Tali by a young woman with enormous breasts. And in the movie, Tuf bangs Tali as part of his terms for saving the planet. We also find out that Josen Rail was portrayed as an evil torturer, rather than a well-meaning but misguided bureaucrat. However, the worst aspect of the film is that movie Tuf was completely fine with the Sulumese multiplying as much as they wanted, as human ingenuity would solve all of their problems. And the most shocking aspect of the movie? Tali Moon wrote it. So as it turns out, when Tuf left, Tali did not spend the rest of her life in prison as she thought she would. Instead, she decided to betray Josen Rail, and so we hear about a mini Game of Thrones where Tali teams up with the ambitious Krigor Blackson. The two release the movie and push Tuf's food reforms. These actions disgrace Josen Rail, and he's forced to retire, and shortly after he dies. However, the reforms in the movie encourage the people of Sulum to throw caution to the wind and increase their population growth. Although they were supposed to have near a century until starvation, they now only have 18 years left. And so Tali asks for more genetically engineered ideas, a second helping. Tuf agrees, but insists on addressing the population directly at a news conference. At the news conference, Tuf announces that he wants to introduce meat beasts, fuel pods, and permanently flying animals. In this announcement, our author gives a shout out to the Banshees of High Cavalon from Dying of the Light. These floating animals are actually the second hydrogen-producing animal that our author has mentioned, and I wonder if dragons in Ice and Fire produce some sort of hydrogen or gas that causes them to breathe flames. Now, Tuf's new reforms would delay starvation for 100 years. However, when addressing the public, Tuf promotes the idea of birth control, which causes a riot. Tali later explains that Tuf criticized the very core of the Sulumese religion. She fears that this could cause a backlash leading to the expansionists winning over the technocrats in the next election. She essentially fears her government will descend from guardianship to timocracy. Tuf leaves and vows to return again, and he leaves behind a couple cats for Tali. The cats' names are Doubt and Ingratitude, a seemingly veiled message to her. Tuf had left behind the cat Foolishness for Kafira K and Guardians. So Anguy, what are your thoughts on Second Helpings?
Well, it doesn't really seem like a full story. It just rehashes the plot of Loaves and Fishes, and it doesn't even have a resolution.
That is true, and this is really a function of how Tuf Voyaging was put together. Our author had written 3 standalone Tuf stories, A Beast for Norn in 1976, Call Him Moses in 1978, and Guardians in 1981. When our author decided to turn it into a full book in 1985, he essentially added an origin story, The Plague Star, and the Sulum trilogy. Second Helpings is the second part of that trilogy, which is why it feels so incomplete.
It's also unusually comical compared to everything else.
Absolutely. In fact, this is without a doubt the most comical, light-in-tone story that our author has ever written.
Though it is still a story about mass starvation.
And I think our author was trying to balance out the other stories in the series to make the whole series more fun. If you remember in The Plague Star, there were some rather irrelevant comical scenes between Tuf and Slice Wan where they verbally spar. They didn't really advance the plot, but they helped lighten the tone.
So I think the big theme of this story is the question of whether absolute power corrupts absolutely.
That it is, and this is again a big part of Plato's Republic. You see, the Republic's central thesis is that the philosopher king is the best ruler to bring about justice and the benefit of society. However, Glaucon and Adimantus, played by Iri and Jiqui last time, bring up a very good point when they talk about the Ring of Gyges. If there were a ring that would make you invisible and thus would allow you to do almost anything, what would stop you from acting in your self-interest and not justly? Why wouldn't you indulge in every vice? Why not rob a bank or sabotage your enemies or have your way with a celebrity? Of course, the Ring of Gyges is a metaphor for the state, as is the parable of the ship and the ark. Glaucon and Adimantus are essentially asking how can there ever be justice if absolute power corrupts absolutely? But Socrates actually argues that absolute power doesn't necessarily corrupt. He believes that only unbalanced and ignorant souls would actually believe that acting unjustly could bring happiness. Indulging in every vice and spreading injustice would only bring misery. The philosopher who has a balanced soul and spends his time educating himself and thinking about the nature of souls would realize this and be immune to corruption.
So Tuf is immune?
That is the real question, and if he is, what is it about Tuf that makes him immune? Why does Tuf get to drive the ship? Tuf isn't exactly philosophical, or generous, or kind. In fact, Tuf occasionally appears to be greedy, ruthless, and niggardly, but at the same time he feels it's important to pay his debts. He certainly doesn't need to return to Sulum, and he has the power to take wealth from people. Yet he weirdly feels obligated to set prices, bargain, and make deals. What's odd is that the Republic specifically says that paying one's debts is an incorrect definition of justice, as some debts shouldn't be paid. Justice is instead the greater good of society, so I'm not certain why this seemingly Lannister nature is so important to Tuf.
Well, I don't think it is. I think paying one's debts is only a pretense. I think Tuf does in fact think about the greater good.
But didn't Josen Rael also think about the greater good? Why is Josen unfit and Tuf fit?
Well, Tuf specifically tells us in the Plague Star why he should rule. He says he has the talent, the intellect, and the will. It's the last part that I'm most concerned with, the will. Personal choice. The Republic ends with something called the myth of where Socrates tries to explain in the afterlife everyone decides what animal they will be reincarnated as. This is really significant as Socrates and true philosopher kings reject the fates. People choose their destiny. A bad man chooses to be bad and receives the consequences he deserves. A just man chooses to be just and receives the consequences he deserves.
What do you mean, not every bad man is punished and every good man rewarded?
According to Socrates, yes they are in terms of their own personal happiness and fulfillment. People that go around hurting everyone are actually miserable fucks, and the happiest people are the ones that are contributing.
So how does this relate to Tuf?
Choice. Tuf never forces his actions on anyone, whether it be Rika Dawnstar, Kafira K, or Tali Moon. He offers them choices, and they choose their fate. Once you accept that you have responsibility for your own destiny and your own life and your own world, you will make different, better, and more enlightened choices. You will choose to be happy by choosing to help society.
I do have to say that Tali Moon is a bit of an excuse maker. She thinks she has no choice but to let the Suthelmese breed and breed.
Exactly, though she does get better between loaves and fishes and second helpings. During loaves and fishes, she's resigned to her fate and expects to spend her whole life in prison. But then she takes control of her destiny and figures out how to survive. In second helpings, though, she still refuses to take initiative on how to fix her planet. I imagine we'll see Tali grow when Tuf returns.
Well, Anguy, if you are correct, then I think our author is making a clever transition from ancient philosophy to modern philosophy. What makes a philosopher king truly great is that he has faced an existential crisis and has come to choose that he will help society.
Well, he has to be educated and talented too, but yes.
And this brings us back to Annalyn from In the House of the Worm. Once he faces his existential crisis, he becomes a better person and chooses to help society. Tali Moon is on her way, though she isn't quite there yet. Now, perhaps I'm suffering from serious confirmation bias, but this all makes me double down on the idea that there's no real prophecy in Ice and Fire. Free will is such a strong part of Plato's Republic and existentialism, and this philosophy is interwoven into the story of In the House of the Worm and Tuf Voyaging. And both stories deal heavily with personal choice and the structure of society and the state. I just don't see how prophecy and fate could possibly play a role in A Song of Ice and Fire. If the book series is commenting on war and politics, and it certainly is, then one must accept that man is responsible for his own actions. Man has free will and the ability to choose. Prophecy and fate means man doesn't have the choice and thus isn't responsible. This would undermine any political commentary that our author is making. Essentially, to have the book series have a point, all prophecy must be fake. Anyway, that's all for Second Helpings. For next time, we'll be reading A Beast for Norn. We have the written and the audio below. A Beast for Norn is actually the first Tuf story that our author wrote, and Tuf acts a little bit differently. See you next time.